Hello everyone, and welcome to the 2021 virtual tour of the Cortez Mining District. My name is Robert McQueen. I'll be your host and guide today. I'm an archaeologist. I've been working out here at Cortez for the last 17 years, documenting its wonderful history. Behind me is Mount Tanabo. It's a 9,150-foot tall mountain, and it is the seat of the Cortez District. Silver was discovered here in 1863, and it continues to be an active mining area, switching over to gold in the 1960s. I'm going to take you up there closer to the mountain. We're going to go look at some of the ruins. I'll give you a little history along the way. Hopefully it's also entertaining. Let's go have some fun. Okay, so at the gateway to Cortez, you get this wonderful bulletproof historic marker. It's an important consideration here in rural Nevada. So it tells you a quick history of Cortez and how it was discovered, and it gives you a nice overview of the mountain. Okay, so I think the sun is going to cooperate enough with me that I can talk real quickly about Mount Tanabo. Mount Tanabo is a quartz and limestone mountain. Miners here in Nevada in the 1860s targeted quartz, convinced that that is where you would find veins of silver. And this quartz outcrop is very, very prominent. It finally earned the name of the Nevada Giant. But they were convinced when they saw this mountain from miles away that they were going to find some riches, and it turns out they were correct. This is some virtual tour bonus footage. This is something I would not have been able to share with you had we been out here live. What we are looking at is the last intact lime kiln in the Cortez District. As I mentioned, Mount Tanabo is a quartz and limestone mountain. When Simon Wenband These are just large pits where the stuff was quarried. The kiln itself, as you can see, the exterior is constructed of lime as well. The interior used a local andesite, which was more heat resistant. These are top-loading kilns. The kiln is actually built into the mountain itself to help give it strength. Hopefully you can see that there are large buttresses coming off of each side of the discharge doors. One thing that I really love about this kiln, and I have to apologize for all the shakiness here, this thing over the years of use would deteriorate, it'd fracture, etc. And they would actually brought in used steam machinery and parts to help rebuild the kiln. These are actually parts of fire grates, tubular boilers, etc. This is the discharge door, not the loading door for the kiln. Okay, so right outside of the discharge door here to the kiln, we actually found this on another lime kiln that was in the district before it got destroyed. I'm hoping I can get this in close enough. Scratched into the rock are a whole series of tick marks, cross marks, counting out in groups of 5. And what we're pretty sure they were doing here as they unloaded the lime kiln is that they were keeping track either of the number of firings or the number of barrel of lime that they were pulling out of the kiln. There's actually a wagon road from this kiln right down to the Tanabo Mill, and I'm going to take you over there to give you a quick tour of Grass Valley. Okay, so I've stepped away from the lime kiln. I'm actually above the town of Cortez and above the Tanabo Mill. We're looking south from Mount Tanabo out into Grass Valley. It is at the bottom of this valley is the Reversible Mining District in the town of Austin, Nevada, and it is from that mining camp that the prospectors came up and discovered Cortez. Cortez actually sits at the intersection of 3 mountain ranges and 3 valleys. Right now we're looking out at the Simpson Park Mountains, named after Lieutenant Simpson, who mapped the route of what would become the Central Overland Route, and it was used by the Pony Express. Panning off to the east, these are the uppermost reaches of the Toyabe Range, and behind me is the Cortez Mountains and Mount Tanabo. Crescent Valley is on the north side of Cortez. This out here is Grass Valley, and immediately to the east is West Pine Valley. You can see a large playa out here in Grass Valley. That is Pleistocene Lake Gilbert. It is now a playa. Another key ingredient in the Russell process, besides the lime that I showed you, is they needed salt. And they would actually go out there and scrape that playa to acquire salt to use in the mill. This is some virtual tour bonus footage. This is another area of Cortez I would not have been able to take you had you been here live. We are at the site of the Consolidated Cortez Mill, which operated from 1923 to about 1930. This was a 125-ton cyanide mill built right outside of the Arctic portal and above the ruins of the Tanabo Mill. The Cons Cortez used the old water system of the Tanabo Mill. The little building here to the left was the assay lab. It was also where they would pour the silver bullion. The Cons Cortez erected the first electric generating plant in the district, and it very briefly gave residents of the town of Cortez electric lighting. This mill had an Alice Chalmers gyratory crusher, a Bunker Hill screen for sorting, Alice Chalmers ball mills and a tube mill, a door duplex classifier, concentration tables, door thickening tanks, agitation tanks. You can see one of the wooden tanks has actually deteriorated away, but all the remnant sediment is still there and intact. The tailings from this mill descends the mountain and extends out several miles into the valley. You can actually see it in Google Earth. They converted to oil flotation in 1927. It employed about 60 men. Concentrates were shipped to Utah. In 1930, with the onset of the Depression, the mill was really only breaking even. Attempts were made to keep the mill running because they knew if they laid off their workers, they probably weren't going to find work anywhere else. But they just couldn't make a go at it during the Depression. This large black stain on the ground is all that is left of a charcoal platform. Out here at Cortez, like many of Nevada's mining camps, they converted the pinyon into charcoal using just open air techniques. They didn't actually build like stone kilns like you sometimes see in other areas. There are hundreds of these little black stains throughout the Cortez Mountains. One of the more famous areas is the Roberts Mountains, which is to the east of us. The Roberts Mountains fed the smelters in the Eureka Mining District, which actually isn't too far away here from Cortez. Charcoal was used in the smelters. It was a key component, key fuel. It was also used in the boilers at the mines themselves. Most of the charcoaling was done by Italian or Swiss Italian immigrants. The Italians were also the primary freighters in the Cortez district, and charcoal was one of the main things that they were freighting. All of these hills are reforested with pinyon and juniper, but they would have been almost completely clear-cut historically. Okay, so we're working our way into the town site of Cortez, but we're going to start here with the ruins of the Tanabo Mill. The town of Cortez sprang up precisely because of the construction of this mill. There's Tanabo again behind us. The Tanabo Mill was built in 1886, just below the Garrison Mine and the Arctic Mine, which were the two most prominent mines in the district. This was the first mill built on the south side of Mount Tanabo and outside of Mill Canyon. The mill was designed by S.R. Crom, the inventor of the Crom rolls for crushing rock, and which started replacing the more traditional stamp batteries. 2 Bruckner cylinders or furnaces were installed for roasting the ore with salt, and Crom's pneumatic jigs separated the lead for smelting from the pulp for leaching. The Bruckner roasters were constructed by the Lane and Bodley Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, and imported all the way out here to Nevada. We're going to move in closer and give you a better view of this. When this mill was constructed in 1886, it was using the Russell process for lixiviation, which was state-of-the-art at the time. All of the equipment that was installed in the mill was very cutting-edge and state-of-the-art at the time. As you can see, there's abundant use of local materials, local stone. Where there is brick evident in the flues that fed the Bruckner furnaces, most of that is locally made brick. There was a clay source out in Grass Valley where they actually made their own brick and brought it up here for use in the mill. If you look closely at these 2 Bruckner furnaces, you can see that stylistically they are distinct from one another. The original Cortez Mill in Mill Canyon, towards the end of its use life, it actually installed a Bruckner furnace. That mill shut down when this one went online, and it's quite probable that one of these 2 furnaces came from Mill Canyon. So yeah, the furnaces were installed on the uppermost tier of the mill. See, a lot of the ruins are down here below us. Somewhat surprisingly, they discharged the tailings right down into the town site. The tailings, however, were also reworked after the town was abandoned, so a little of that is actually disturbance from some later attempts at recovering silver. Okay, so now we are in the town of Cortez. We're going to poke around some of the old ruins, buildings, and things in various states of decay. Cortez was the third and last community established in the district, but it was also the largest and one of the longest lasting, and it had regional importance. It had a company store, a school, a post office, in addition to servicing the miners that were working in the district. It became an important place for the area ranchers as well. At its peak, Cortez had a maximum population of maybe 100 people, but it also included a very large Chinese contingency. In the 1870s, Simon Wenban, who owned the Tanabo Mill and he owned the Garrison Mine, which is the largest mine in the district, he made the unprecedented move of firing all of his Cornish miners and replacing them with Chinese labor. And he actually put the Chinese underground, and he put them in his mill. And they lasted, the Chinese worked here in Cortez until the early 1900s. And, you know, if you know your Western history, this is during a period where there was a very, very strong anti-Chinese sentiment. And how he was, you know, able to pull this off for a good 20 years is pretty impressive. But you can see the town site sets up here on the alluvial fan. Great little views, Grass Valley and the surrounding environment. So yeah, what I was showing you here during this quick introduction to Cortez, this is one of the adobe houses that exists in Cortez. There's 3 or 4 that are somewhat intact. Adobe, of course, over the years will finally melt and go back to nature. The construction technique is a little bit unique. You actually have some very large baseline material And you can see there's a little central ridge, and then it transitions into what is a more traditional adobe brick. And very simple stick and earth roof covering. Some of the other houses are certainly better than this, as I'll show you here in a minute. So right next to the Tanabo Mill is a small gully that heads up the hills. This gully was the Chinese section of the town of Cortez. And there really isn't much left of their residences. They lived in dugouts, which are just simple little excavations into the hillside. But if you go poking around Cortez and keep a keen eye out, you will find a lot of evidence of the Chinese being a part of the community. And this, of course, is a rice bowl, porcelain rice bowl. Okay, heading on down through the town side of Cortez. This is a much more traditional wood-framed residence, somewhat typical of most mining camps across the west, old gable and shed construction. We know this home was occupied by a family at least through the 1930s. At one point in time, they actually had a little bit of landscaping to go with it. We also have their garage, repurposed sheet metal everywhere, flattened tin cans. Again, not necessarily unique to Cortez. Well, this was one of the larger homes in the district. As you can see, it has definitely seen some better days. It was actually standing when I recorded it 10 years ago. Somebody thought it would be funny to pull one of the walls off and seal its fate. If we were in Kansas, I could tell you this got run over by a tornado or something, but instead it's just vandalism. The privy, surprisingly, is still standing. I actually have photographs of two kids standing right in front of one of these windows here by the front door. This was one of the fancier residences here at Cortez. It's the only one with this style of roof. It actually has a couple of built-in cabinets in the dining room, and it has a half basement underneath. There's a abundant debris field around me that I don't want to. We'll get closer here. A little bit closer shot here. After everything at Cortez shut down in the 1930s, last family left in the early 1940s. Shortly after that, somewhat of a hermity gentleman moved into the abandoned town site. His name was Lloyd High. He became the self-declared caretaker of the ghost town. And in the 1950s and 1960s, if people came to visit the town, he would spin all kinds of yarns for them and entertain them while they were walking around and enjoying the ruins. And Lloyd actually lived here in this home. He finally left in, I believe, the late 1960s. This is another one of Cortez's adobe residences. And as you can see, Mother Nature is trying its hardest to take it back. Unlike the first one I showed you, this one is quite a bit larger. It's long and skinny. And it actually had several doorways against one of its long walls. And a resident who lived here in Cortez as a child said that this is actually one of the gentlemen that was running the freight companies here in Cortez. This is where his teamsters lived. This adobe ruin also used the same construction technique of having large aggregate near the base and more traditional brick hitting up the walls. Okay, this is the Cortez Cemetery. It's located on the edge of town. The cemetery has graves dating from about the 1890s all the way into the 1980s. The later period graves are local ranch families, and they continue, as you can see, they continue to maintain the cemetery and visit it fairly frequently. This is primarily a Euro-American cemetery. The Chinese had their own cemetery across the other side of Grass Valley, closer to Shoshone Wells, which was another camp here at Cortez. There are several unmarked graves like you will get in historic cemeteries. And I would guess that there is probably in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 people residing here. Okay. Well, that's the first part one. Do we need a quick break? Optimize for videos, maximize. Okay, so here we go. This is, we've moved to the other side of the mountain. So. This is the opening to Mill Canyon. We're on the north face of Mount Tanabo. This canyon actually opens up out into Crescent Valley, and I'll pan around here in a second and give you a shot of Crescent Valley. Well, I often describe Mill Canyon as the bookends to Cortez, for good reason. Once we get up into this canyon, it looks kind of narrow here at the opening. It opens up and is a very lovely place. It's one of the few parts of the mountain that actually has a perennial water source, and hopefully you can hear it. It is aptly named Mill Creek. Mill Canyon is where silver was discovered at Cortez in 1863. It was the location of the first camp in the mining district. It was the location of the first mill in the mining district. It was also the location of one of the first recorded deaths. It also had one of the last mills to operate in the district, one of the last recorded deaths. This is Crescent Valley. If you travel about 30 miles north to the upper end of Crescent Valley, you reach a little town of Biawawi, which was a railroad station that was created to service Cortez when the Transcontinental Railroad came through in 1869. After the railroad came through, Cortez shifted its focus. Instead of going south towards Austin, where the original prospectors had come from, they shifted everything north towards the railroad for all their freighting and shipping needs. So let's go into Mill Canyon. So we're in the uppermost reaches of Mill Canyon. It's about 1.5 miles up from its opening. Almost to its apex. We're at Crest, and then you cross over to the south side of Mount Tanabo. You can see we're just below some of the remnant snow. It's a beautiful day here in the canyon. The mule's ear is blooming, the lupins are blooming. Hopefully this footage is capturing some of that. But the reason we came up here, this is bonus virtual tour footage. Something I wouldn't have been able to show you had we done a real tour. what we're looking at here, this is the lower ore bin of the M&E Mines aerial tramway. This thing dates to the 1930s. I'm going to try and change lenses here, and I'll give you a shot of the upper bin. The upper bin is intact. This is actually a very short tramway. It only, the rim of the canyon is only about 1,000 feet up. This aerial tramway is a Bleacher double rope reversible aerial tramway, which is a very fancy way of saying that the buckets don't travel in a circle around the tramway terminals. They simply go up and down in a straight line. A tramway of this design can only have 2 buckets, one on the left cable and one on the right cable. The bucket goes up, gets filled with ore, and comes back down on the exact same path. Let's try and get the upper for you. Alright, I'm going to try my darndest to hold this still for everybody. That is the upper ore bin, 1,000 feet above where I'm standing. As you can see, when you look at the front of the ore bin, there's a deep V design to it. That ore bin is actually split in half, so that when the ore is dumped in from the top, some of it spills to the left side and some spills to the right side. And that is where the buckets on the cables would actually pull up and get filled up before descending down to the lower station. An interesting side note to this tramway: the tramway was built over top of some mining claims that were not owned by the M&E mine operators. And the owners of these claims filed lawsuit against the M&E saying you can't use this tramway to move your ore. Judges agreed and put in injunctions, and there was all kinds of fighting going on and everything else. Here's one of a handful of wood-framed cabins that are still in Mill Canyon. This is actually known as, it's known both as the Leonard Cabin and the McGill Cabin, named after a couple of different families that have lived in it. Both families around the time period of the 1940s, 1950s. The men were employed as contract miners or lessees, if you will, and they were working right across the road up in that mine right there. This is one of several stone ruins that you can see up here in Mill Canyon. It's a very simple residence for a miner. These kind of ruins are ubiquitous to Nevada's mining camps. Even some of the larger towns that developed, like Goldfield, first started out with these kind of little places to live. I'm going to pause this for a second and get closer. When you look in through the entry, you can actually see there's a nice cozy little fireplace in the corner. It looks kind of rough around the edges, but it would have been a fairly pleasant place to call home. I mean, these kind of structures, they're not really a measure of social status. They really aren't indicative of, you know, class or wealth. They're not indicative of ethnicity. They really just speak of expediency. When you get into one of these mining camps and you don't have access to lumber yet, this is what you build and call home. Again, nice little shots of Mill Canyon. So this is the camp of Mill Canyon. It's the earliest camp in the Cortez district, dates to its founding and discovery in 1863. When it was first founded, the town boasted of having a blacksmith shop, a couple of boarding houses, and a scattering of homes. Just below the town site is the location of the first mill in the district, known as the Cortez Mill. The town had a few dozen residences in it during its peak. The Cortez Mill shut down in 1886 when the Tanabo Mill went, and at that point in time most of the residents of Mill Canyon left and moved over to the new town of Cortez. The town was reoccupied in the 1930s when the Roberts Mining Company came into the canyon and built the Roberts Mill. It's actually this house that I'm trying to get you some footage of. The house is known as the Reversible Cabin. It was actually built by the Roberts Company. It was the superintendent's home for the gentleman that managed the Roberts Mill. The Russells were a later family that lived here in Mill Canyon in the 50s and 60s. Right behind it is what is left of the Mill Canyon School. And there was a small residence attached to it for the school teacher. If you wander through the sage, which I'm not going to do out of fear of hurting myself, there are several foundations, little earth dugouts, etc. As I mentioned, they talk about some of the stone buildings. There is one that is still standing here in Mill Canyon. This is actually probably one of the oldest ruins in all of Cortez. As you can see, it's fairly substantial. One thing I absolutely love about this building is that the safe is still hanging out in the corner inside. I'm sure someone has tried to steal it at some point. The later Roberts Mill is located further down the canyon, which we'll get to here in a second. This is the grave of John H. Walker, and you're actually looking at a partially toppled headstone and a footstone. This is the first recorded or known death in the Cortez district, and he died in 1868. His cause of death was 3 bullet wounds resulting from a gunfight he got in with a gentleman by the last name of McClure. And of all things, they were fighting over the rights to some hay that was growing out in Crescent Valley. This is part of the ruins of the Cortez Mill. This is the first mill constructed in Cortez, and it dates to 1864. A little bit of stone walls, one of the old pulley shafts. Most of the mill was actually constructed across the road and down in the stream bed, but it is currently buried in a thicket of willow, wild rose, and sagebrush. Very, very difficult to see, even if you know what you're looking for. 2 of the men that discovered Cortez, Simon Wenban and George Hurst, both had experience with milling on the Comstock in Virginia City and the west end of Nevada. And they imported the washoe process out here to Cortez using washoe pans and amalgamation. The mill failed. By 1865, they'd given up on the washoe process. In 1867, I believe, they switched over to what's called the Reese River process, which uses Stedefelt furnaces and begins the process of roasting the ore as part of the smelting process. They had stamp batteries in here. They installed a Bruckner furnace in 1876, which apparently worked better, but it still wasn't a complete success. In the 1880s, a lot of districts started switching over to lixiviation, including here at Cortez, when Ban 1886 constructed his Tanabo mill on the other side of the mountain, and when he did that, this mill ceased to operate. So we're closer to the bottom of the canyon, and what we are looking at here is actually the ruins of two different mills. We have the scant little foundation over here and the much larger pile of toothpicks of a second mill here. I actually want to talk about the smaller one first because it predates the second one. This little foundation here is all that's left of a 50-ton cyanide mill known as the Minardi Mill. Captain John Minardi laid claim to being a Rough Rider with Teddy Roosevelt. He came up here in the Mill Canyon after earning some fame as a mine speculator and investor down in Goldfield. He constructed this mill in 1913. It only ran for about 2 years before burning to the ground, and he didn't bother rebuilding it. One thing that Minardi did do was engineer the tapping of a spring up Mill Canyon, buried a pipeline down to his mill to feed it with water. And that is one reason this later mill, known as the Roberts Mill, was constructed in this location, was to take advantage of that pre-existing pipeline and water supply. And I'm going to move up closer to this mill and give you some better history. One thing that I appreciate about the Minardi Mill, even though it only operated for a couple of years, in 1913, this is kind of a transitional period in mill construction for various reasons, not just technological reasons, but just actual material reasons. If you compare this mill ruins to the Cortez Mill up the canyon, 1864, if you compare it to the Tanabo Mill, 1886, both those early mills use a lot of local materials, half-cut timbers from the surrounding mountains, a lot of stone, undressed stone, etc. This Minardi Mill still uses a lot of stone in its foundation, but then you see it being capped and integrated with imported lumber, and there's a lot of iron hardware, which also would have been imported, factory manufactured components. So it's kind of transitional. You compare it then over here to the Roberts Mill, and it is 100% imported material. The foundation is poured in place, concrete. All of the lumber is imported, milled. The machinery is, of course, all imported. So you can really see that that's a much later design elements in the 1930s. So probably the most impressive mill ruins we have at Cortez are these right here, which is what's left of the Roberts Company Mill. The Roberts Company is named after Bella McCord Roberts, who was a newspaper heiress out of Los Angeles. This mill was built in 1930. It operated in fits and starts up until about 1940, and it toggled between being a flotation mill and conversion to a cyanide mill. There are no production figures for the mill. There were two ball mills installed inside, and I'm going to get a little bit closer here in a minute. One of the problems with the Roberts Mill was the constant litigation the company as a whole was getting tangled up with its mine, its primary mine, the Emma E, and various people laying claim to the ore in that mine. Judges kept shutting the mine down, and without the mine operating, the mill couldn't operate. Some parts of the interior are accessible if you're safe about it. In addition to the Emma E mine, which was their primary mine, the Roberts Mill had two different aerial tramways strung across to a couple of mines that were immediately across the canyon. There was an adit behind the mill called the Berlin Portal that also supplied a little bit of ore, but not enough to keep it running. This over here is the Blacksmith Shop. We'll come back to that. It's cute. But here it's one of the ball mills. And second ball mill. The ore bin, of course, being right above. The ore bin was fed by two rail tramways. There was also a rampway for truck traffic to come in. Nice view of the canyon and all the ruins. We do have record of at least one recorded death associated with this mill. Gentleman had a heart attack on one of the upper floors and fell down to the bottom of the mill. This mill did have a diesel electric motor and provided electricity to the camp of the reoccupied town of Mill Canyon. Someone, of course, decided to pull their pickup truck in here several years ago and steal the equipment. So yeah, this is the Roberts Company Blacksmith Shop. It's across the canyon from the mill. There is a mine adit literally right outside the front door of the blacksmith shop. There's a nice set of tracks buried in the grass here for the ore carts to pass right in front of, and it leads out to a couple of ore bins just over the spoil pile. One thing I always really liked about this, hopefully it's not going to be too dark when I go in. The forge is still intact. The heat flashing, just corrugated steel workbenches. There's your artsy shot of the Roberts Mill through the blacksmith window. Man, as you can see, it kind of turned itself into a junkyard. More workbenches, etc. One thing that's really, really cool, you got galvanized sheet metal doors on this blacksmith shop. And hopefully I can get up close enough. They use these doors to do some calculations. There's some rough sketches of whatever it is they're trying to build. Somewhere on here, the Kilroy. There's some later graffiti, of course, but I always like seeing, 18 cars. Whether they're coming out of that adit right there or not, I really don't know. But I think it's fascinating. So that's going to wrap up our tour of the Cortez District. I hope it was fun, mildly educational, and nobody got seasick with my I look forward to seeing everyone in real time, live and in person, for our next meeting in 2022. Keep enjoying the conference, and I'll see you.